Hi there, this is Gareth Hines, and I'm here to show you a time lapse of painting the title page for my new graphic novel, The Iliad. So the first thing that I'm going to do is paint in the sky, and this involves a really big wash of a single color, which is always a little bit tricky to do, but I'll tell you some of how I approach that. So I've mixed up in this cup you see me holding a big supply of this color, which is mostly ultramarine blue and a little bit of Prussian blue. And then as I start painting, my goal is to keep the paint wet. In order to keep it from getting blotchy, what you want is to keep a wet edge on the area that you're working with. And then the other thing that I'm doing is I'm actually adding a little bit of water as I go down towards the horizon because I want a bit of a gradient. The sky has a tendency to be a deeper blue as you look up, and as you get down towards the horizon it becomes paler. So I'm trying to keep this wet and keep adding water to it, and as you can see I'm sort of working on two different fronts because as I come down over the prow of that ship, suddenly I can't just paint straight across anymore. I've broken it into a couple of different zones, so I'm working quickly so that I can paint this area on the left and then get back to the area on the right before the paint dries out. Now, I see that there are some bits of pigment, some little streaks on the upper right there, and also there's a little bit of blotchiness on the left. And so, one of the things about watercolor is things usually don't come out perfect. Watercolor is a little bit hard to control, which is also nice sometimes. It gives you a lot of happy accidents and a lot of cool textures and things. But I might have to decide whether I'm okay with these little areas that didn't quite come out flat, or whether I want to try to fix them, which actually there's some things in watercolor that are easy to fix. This is not one of those things. If you get the wash wrong initially, that's pretty hard to fix. Or I could try to fix them digitally. That's always an option later on after I scan the art. And in this case, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to accept the blotchiness in the sky, and I'm going to fix the streaks digitally. Now the other thing that happens is that some of the edges of this wash are a little bit ragged, and those are things that I will fix later on manually. I'll show you how you can actually kind of clean up some edges and actually erase some of the color partially, which is something that most people don't realize you can do with watercolor. Okay, so now I'm mixing up a darker blue, and this blue is ultramarine, Prussian, and a little bit of black, and just using more pigment. And then as we get up towards the top of the waves, I'm going to bring in some green, because water, where it gets really transparent at the top of a wave, turns very green, and that's mostly using permanent green yellow. I also use sap green. I also use Viridian or phthalo green sometimes. And then I'm going to mix up a color for the sail, and the sail is going to be sort of almost like a beige, like an unbleached cotton kind of color, and that's made with yellow ochre and a little bit of brown. And you can see that I'm actually adding a little bit more brown as I get down towards the bottom of the sail. I'm sort of creating a little bit of a gradient to make that sail look more three-dimensional. Sometimes I will add the shading later as a second layer of watercolor, but if I can build some of that into the initial wash, it's great. And then I'm going to mix up a color for the hull of the ship. Now, Homer is often talking about the black ships, and we can theorize that these ships were coated with tar or something to seal them that was probably dark colored. And so I'm mixing up this kind of tar color using burnt umber and black. This wash does not have to be perfectly smooth. It's okay if it gets a little bit blotchy or blobby. And again, you might notice that I sort of let the paint be a little bit thinner at one point, and then it gets darker here as I go along the hull. So again, I'm building in a little bit of three-dimensionality. I'm actually using a smaller brush now. I switched from my big number 40 to a number 16. Mostly I really only use 3 brushes. That number 40 for big washes, the 16 for almost everything, and then the 10 for a few little details here and there. I've color-coded the armies in this book so that you can sort of tell who's who. And the Achaeans mostly are fiery colors, red, orange, yellow, and a little bit of yellow-green, and a little bit into the purples, the sort of royal purple. But Achilles, he leads the Myrmidons, and I made the Myrmidons all red and black. And that's because their name comes from Myrmex, which means ant. And so I think of ants, sort of stay in the red, black, brown color palette. Speaking of which, that was a quick glimpse at my watercolor palette. If I let the paint dry and then I go back with a second layer of red, that will create a darker shading under the rails. So this is really where I generate a lot more three-dimensionality. So now I'm going to go back. I'm actually going to do a little bit of that erasing that I was talking about. I'm cleaning up these edges around the two characters, which is Achilles and somebody. We don't know who's under the helmet. It might be Patroclus or one of his other captains. So what I'm using is just a brush with no color on it and a paper towel. And you sort of dip the brush in water a little bit, get it a little damp, and then you can kind of you can lift up color if it's still wet, but even when it's dry, you can kind of dab some water on it, kind of scrub it a tiny bit with the brush, and then dab it with a paper towel, and it will pick up some of the color. And you can repeat that a few times, and you can get a fair amount of the pigment off the paper. You cannot get 100% erasure, but you can make it a lot lighter, and then I'm going back in with color and kind of cleaning up the edge a little bit. All right, so now I'm painting the skin tones, and these skin tones are mostly burnt umber. These are characters who spend all day out in the sun, and so they're very tan. And burnt umber works pretty well for a range of kind of tanned skin tones. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the bronze armor. Coloring the bronze is actually kind of tricky. So you can see I'm painting it here kind of almost a little bit gold. This is yellow ochre with a little bit of brown and a tiny bit of red in it. Real bronze, it can be a kind of a range of colors, but it tends to be orangier than this. And it's very, very shiny. And the problem is it looks very much like the color of flesh and also like the color of sand or dirt that they're going to be fighting on. So I kind of cheated and made the bronze a little bit more gold in order to distinguish it from the skin tones and from the dirt. By the way, I'm going to be adding the title of the book onto the sail here. I'm going to be drawing that on a separate layer and compositing it digitally because I don't want any English text in the art. Because if the book gets translated, I want them to be able to just slap the foreign translation on there very easily. I don't want them to have to Photoshop out the English first. So I keep any kind of lettering or anything like that on a separate layer. Sound effects also on separate layers. So these ships that they use are called Penta Contours, which means 50 oars. So you'd have 25 rowers on each side, and then you could have some additional fighters or somebody, in the ship as well. But you had to have at least those 50 rowers. And then Achilles' shield has dolphins on it. That's just my invention. That's not something Homer described. A lot of the shield designs are based on real shield designs, either from the Bronze Age or from later classical Greece. We actually have almost nothing that survives from the Bronze Age, but we have lots of classical Greek artifacts and also classical Greek paintings of subjects from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so I used some of those to design the shields. But this particular shield is an adaptation of one of those designs. And I thought it was appropriate for Achilles because his mother is Thetis, who is kind of an ocean goddess. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. And again, this is The Iliad coming from Candlewick Press in March 2019. Thanks for watching.